The lie of North Korea's collapse. Let's cast aside illusions and face reality. 8. Creating the miracle on the Taedong River. North Korean Workers' Party says denuclearization is possible. Over the past 30 years, the theory of North Korea's collapse has been periodically reproduced. From the Arduous March, the death of Kim Jong-il, the failure of currency reform, the tightening of sanctions against North Korea, to the COVID-19 border closures at every juncture, predictions emerged that this time is different, yet the regime persisted. Today, we analyze the structural causes of these repeated miscalculations by dividing them into 5 axes: China's continued buffer zone strategy, the North Korean establishment's maintenance of survival-oriented control, the absence of incentives for the free world to attack North Korea, economic operations achievable through limited external openness, and the weakening of South Korea's will and capacity to pressure for unification. We will then examine why short and mid-term collapse scenarios are difficult to establish when these 5 conditions operate in a mutually reinforcing manner. Additionally, we will look at possible counterarguments and risk factors. In any case, I hope this serves as an opportunity to help us avoid getting lost and wasting time by misidentifying the location. Let us look at the core conclusion first. The viability of the North Korean regime is effectively determined not by internal vulnerabilities, but by the strategic interests and will of external actors, namely China, Russia, South Korea, and the United States. The uniqueness of the current situation lies in the fact that not just one of the 5 decisive conditions, such as China's continued buffer zone strategy, the North Korean establishment's maintenance of survival-oriented control, the absence of incentives for the free world to attack North Korea, economic operations achievable through limited external openness, and the weakening of South Korea's will and capacity to pressure for unification, but all 5 are being met simultaneously. This is enhancing the structural stability of the regime more than at any other time in the past. For a long time, the outside world, including South Korea, has only told people what they wanted to hear, rather than the reality. The media has reinforced this tendency, and even those covering this topic cannot confidently claim that they have not pandered to the public. As a result, this has produced a negative effect. People have been subjected to false hope, forced to sit and wait for the collapse of North Korea while neglecting actual tasks, disappointed by reality that contradicts their heightened expectations, and eventually, exhausted from waiting, they give up and abandon the hope. Now is the time to let go of the lingering attachment to the collapse of North Korea. Let us examine in detail why this is the case. This is due to the following 5 realities. 1. China continues to maintain North Korea as a buffer state and supports the survival of the regime. 2. The North Korean establishment is desperate to maintain the current regime and possesses the capability to fully sustain its current control organizations, the party security agencies, and the military. 3. The free world bloc, including South Korea, the United States, and Japan, has no sufficient incentive to attack a nuclear-armed North Korea. 4. North Korea can operate the economy necessary to maintain its regime solely through openness with limited countries such as China and Russia, while excluding South Korea. 5. South Korea, which was the greatest threat to North Korea, has weakened its will for unification and lacks the power and will to exert substantial pressure on the North. Now let us delve deeper into each reality. Axis 1. China's buffer zone strategy and physical stagnation. 1. The immutability of strategic motives. The foundation of China's policy toward North Korea is not ideological solidarity, but a calculation of geopolitical gains and losses. The scenarios Beijing fears most are the 3 consequences following the collapse of the North Korean regime. 1. A massive influx of refugees across the 1,400 kilometers border. 2. The loss of leverage in negotiations with the U.S. And 3. The advance of free world allies to the Yalu River. This formula has not fundamentally changed over the past few decades, and the priorities of China's official policy toward North Korea still follow the order of prevention of war, prevention of instability, denuclearization. In other words, this means that the survival of the North Korean regime is a higher goal than denuclearization. China attaches little significance to North Korea's nuclear armament. This is because if China were to cease economic aid to North Korea, the country's military capabilities as well as its economy would be neutralized within a few months. This is especially true given that China is North Korea's only alternative in a reality where Russia's economic and national capacity to replace China is steadily diminishing. In effect, North Korea is no different from a vassal state of China, and China is essentially protecting the Kim dynasty. For North Korea, which lacks economic self-reliance and depends on China for over 90% of its economy, nuclear armament is nothing more than a bluff. From China's perspective, a nuclear-armed North Korea provides stable and inexpensive protection for the long Sino-North Korean border. While this situation may be somewhat excessive and bothersome, it is not necessarily a bad thing. 2. Infrastructure entrenchment. Follows the laws of physics, not policy. This strategy is not merely rhetoric, but is implemented in physical infrastructure. The vast majority of crude oil consumed by North Korea, approximately 520,000 tons annually, or about 90% of demand, is supplied through the Dandong-Sinwiju pipeline. This pipeline transports Daeking crude oil, which is rich in wax if the supply is interrupted. The oil solidifies inside the pipes, making it virtually impossible to restart. Due to this physical characteristic, this pipeline was excluded from sanctions during the 2017 UN Security Council discussions on sanctions against North Korea. Regardless of political will, the infrastructure itself is effectively designed as an always-open valve. 3. Historical patterns of leverage. Exercise warnings, not inducing collapse. While there are instances where China has used crude oil as leverage, their nature has been limited. In 2003, in response to North Korea's missile provocations, Beijing suspended crude oil supplies for 3 days, successfully inducing North Korea to return to the six-party talks. In November 2017, during a sanctions phase, refined oil exports temporarily recorded a statistical ZO. Both instances were not aimed at the North Korean regime, but were signals for specific actions, and their duration was extremely short. This supports the proposition that China possesses leverage but has little incentive to use it. 4. The emergence of Russia as a second axis. As relations between North Korea and Russia have rapidly tightened since the 2022 war in Ukraine, North Korea has, for the first time, broken away from its sole dependence on China and secured a dual patronage structure. However, this is not a complete replacement, but a partial and limited one, with China still remaining as a primary supplier of crude oil and consumer goods. While this provides North Korea with a dual negotiating power, appearing to create a tactical negotiation structure where it can rely on one patron, even if one exerts pressure, there is virtually no way to escape absolute dependence on China. This is because Russia lacks the capacity to replace the support provided by China and is becoming increasingly weak. Nevertheless, it is true that the Russian stage has expanded North Korea's room for maneuver. Despite the existence of a minority of dissent within China regarding its policy toward North Korea, it has failed to become the mainstream in the policy-making process for decades, rather. The close ties between North Korea and Russia since 2022 appear to have provided China with additional justification to ease sanctions against North Korea. In other words, China's buffer zone strategy is becoming more robust than ever before due to the combination of 4 factors. 1. Unchanging strategic motives. 2. Irreversible physical infrastructure. 3. A history of using leverage that has been exercised only on a limited basis. And 4. The emergence of Russia as a complementary axis. Axis 2. The establishment's survival-oriented control. 1. The fundamental error of collapse theory. Misidentification of actors. Traditional collapse theory implicitly relies on the model that the system collapses when public discontent exceeds a critical threshold. However, as comparative political studies on the collapse of authoritarian regimes commonly point out, it is not the majority of the population that determines the survival of the system, but the cohesion of the small elite group that actually controls the mechanisms of control. Look at Iran now. Despite large-scale anti-government protests in Iran, the elite group of the Revolutionary Guard continues its war against the United States by continuing succession. even after many of its leaders were beheaded. This is because their vested interests are so big and sweet that losing them would mean death, so they band together and risk their lives. In the case of North Korea, for this minority group, key officials of the Workers' Party, repressive organizations such as the Ministry of State Security and the Ministry of Social Security, the military command, and the National Trade Network colluding with them, the collapse of the system means the disappearance of physical survival itself. Unlike the elites of other authoritarian countries, their exit options of overseas asylum or property flight are extremely limited. Therefore, their political actions are entirely focused on defending the system, not reforming it. 2. The continuity and advancement of control infrastructure. North Korea's control system, a deterrence mechanism symbolized by a whole social organizational structure that binds the entire population to control, a multi-layered surveillance network, an administrative registration system, controlling residents and movement, and political prisoner camps has been maintained for decades without fundamental collapse. On the contrary, it has recently been becoming more sophisticated. With the addition of technical control measures, such as mobile phone wiretapping and electronic surveillance of border areas, this suggests that control capabilities are being renewed by absorbing new technologies rather than weakening over time. 3. The paradoxical lesson of the Arduous March. Even during the Arduous March in the mid-1990s, a period marked by massive starvation, the regime did not collapse. On the contrary, throughout this period, residents spontaneously developed an informal market economy, jangmadang, to survive without state rationing. Rather than acting as a threat to the regime, this functioned as a safety net that allowed residents to resolve on their own the responsibility of guaranteeing minimum livelihoods that the regime would otherwise have to bear. In other words, a causal relationship between severe economic hardship and regime collapse is not empirically confirmed in North Korea. In other words, the possibility of an uprising from below is structurally low as long as control mechanisms are functioning, and the possibility of defection from above is even lower due to the vital interests of the vested interests. The core of this axis is that both pathways are closed. Axis 3, absence of incentives for the free world to attack nuclear-armed states. 1. Let us examine the cost-benefit structure of deterrence. North Korea is already a nuclear power. This fact alone fundamentally restricts the policy options toward North Korea for South Korea, the United States, and Japan. Attempts at regime change through preemptive military action entail the following costs, regardless of success. South Korea. As the capital region is located just tens of kilometers from the demilitarized zone, massive human and economic damage is expected in the early stages of hostilities using only conventional forces. If the possibility of nuclear use is added to this, the scale of damage expands to an uncontrollable level. United States. The risk of destroying an ally's capital and the potential for escalation involving China and Russia outweigh the strategic benefits gained from regime change. Japan. There is little incentive to participate in preemptive action while risking missile attacks on its own territory. 2. Maintaining the status quo is a safe equilibrium point. As a result of these calculations, the most rational policy for all three countries is not to actively induce collapse, but to maintain the status quo through containment and deterrence. This aligns with the actual policy trajectories of the past few decades. While oscillating between hardline and conciliatory stances, no government has ever adopted actual military regime change as a policy goal. The very fact of nuclear armament effectively seals off any external coercive means capable of inducing collapse. Axis 4. A minimum survival economy completed through limited opening. 1. It is a structure capable of withstanding isolation from the entire international community. While a causal chain of economic isolation, economic hardship, regime instability is generally assumed, North Korea possesses alternative pathways that prevent this chain from operating. The key point is that North Korea can secure all three major resources: energy, food, and foreign currency necessary for maintaining the regime solely through limited exchanges with China and Russia without needing to trade with the rest of the world. Energy: crude oil. The Chinese pipeline, approximately 520,000 tons per year, supplying about 90% of demand, serves as a physically irreplaceable basic supply line. Energy refined oil. The expansion of supply via Russian oil tankers and railways, estimated at least 1 million to 1.5 million barrels in 2024, 2 to 3 times the UN ceiling, is serving as a supplementary supply line that has surged in recent years. Food, new supplies, such as Russian flour, are sharing the structural deficit with China's traditional aid. Foreign currency mineral exports and payments for providing weapons and troops to Russia INSS, estimate of $767 billion to $14.4 billion. August 2023 to December 2024 are becoming new channels for foreign currency inflows on a scale equivalent to North Korea's GDP. 2. There are also structural limitations to the sanctions network. Although international sanctions are designed on the premise of blocking trade with the entire world, for North Korea, it is sufficient to keep only 2 doors open from the start, China and Russia. In other words, no matter how tightly the mesh of the sanctions becomes, the loopholes that North Korea must actually pass through have already been secured. The external variable of the war in Ukraine has actually reinforced this structure to some extent. This is because the channels for foreign currency inflow, which had been blocked by sanctions, have been reopened through a completely different route, the provision of weapons and troops. Furthermore, North Korea is mobilizing state capabilities to conduct large-scale cryptocurrency hacking. And this is also becoming a massive source of unofficial revenue that greatly aids in maintaining the North Korean regime. In other words, North Korea has already established the minimum economic circulation structure necessary to maintain the regime through limited relations, with only 2 countries, without complete opening to the outside world, or returning to the international community, which structurally reveals the limitations of a sanctions-oriented pressure strategy. Axis 5, South Korea's weakened will for unification and pressure capacity. 1. The relaxation of the most fundamental threat. For decades, the most fundamental threat to the North Korean regime was not military power, but South Korea's aspiration for unification itself, which combined legitimacy, economic power, and international support. However, the nature of this threat has recently been undergoing a structural change. 2. Changes in generational perception. As a generational shift takes place, attitudes toward unification within South Korean society are changing significantly. Public opinion polls consistently confirm that the younger generation tends to perceive unification not as a natural national task, but as a burdensome choice entailing massive costs and social unrest. The spread of the perception that there is no need to rush unification in this manner right now acts to lower the political priority of unification-related agendas in the policy-making process. 3. Lack of policy consistency. As hardline and conciliatory stances toward North Korea repeatedly alternate with every change of administration, it has become structurally difficult to maintain a consistent pressure strategy over the long term. Given the political structure of a single 5-year term, no government can guarantee a consistent stance of pressure toward North Korea that will continue into the next administration. 4. It is a shift in national priorities. With a multitude of pressing challenges such as the demographic crisis caused by low birth rates and an aging population, slowing growth, and the management of geopolitical risks, it is becoming increasingly difficult to secure the political momentum to fully commit national capabilities to the long-term task of unification, which is fraught with uncertainty. In other words, from North Korea's perspective, this is a decisive signal. This is because it means that the actor who could have posed the most fundamental threat to the regime is voluntarily lowering the intensity of that threat. These 5 conditions do not operate independently, but reinforce one another. China's buffer zone strategy, Axis 1, provides material support for the vested interests control resources, Axis 2. Attack deterrence through nuclear armament. Axis 3 creates conditions that allow for a focus solely on internal control, Axis 2, without external military pressure. The bifurcated minimal economic structure of China and Russia, Axis 4, fundamentally limits the effectiveness of economic pressure from the international community. South Korea's weakened will to exert pressure Axis 5 effectively neutralizes even the only remaining non-military and non-economic leverage legitimacy and pressure for unification. In other words, the current phase, in which these 5 axes are simultaneously valid, can be described as a rare period where both external factors, support from China and Russia, non-intervention by the free world, and the easing of pressure on South Korea and internal factors. The control of vested interests are aligned in a manner favorable to the survival of the regime. This is the reason why repeated theories of collapse in the past have always been wrong, and why similar predictions in the future must be treated with caution. Let us also examine counterarguments and risk factors. Succession uncertainty. There is no guarantee that the power succession process following Kim Jong-un will proceed stably. Historically, authoritarian regimes are most severely exposed to structural vulnerabilities during periods of supreme leadership transition. However, under the current North Korean regime, as long as a member of the Baekdu bloodline is put forward as a successor, regardless of whether the successor is male or female, the current vested interests, led by the Central Committee of the Workers' Party, have an absolute incentive to continue the hereditary system and feel secure. Possibility of China recalculating. As North Korea and Russia become closer, China's influence over North Korea may weaken relatively. This could be a factor that prompts Beijing to reevaluate the cost-benefit of its buffer zone strategy. However, it is nearly impossible for Russia to replace China to that extent. This calculation could change drastically if there is a fundamental restructuring of U.S.-China relations, for instance. If a grand compromise, including the Korean Peninsula issue, is reached by opting for a balance of power through a moderate division of spheres rather than a wasteful confrontation between the two nations. Long-term effects of the Jangmadang generation, even if the shift in values among the younger generation, who have accumulated experience in the market economy, contributed to system stability in the short term. There is a possibility that control costs will continue to rise in the long term through the influx of information and the spread of comparative consciousness. However, the modernization of current control measures and technologies could lower these costs. Fluctuality of South Korean public opinion. The weakening will for unification is a current trend, not an irreversible constant. Public opinion could shift back to a hardline stance depending on various variables, such as the intensity of North Korean provocations, the nature of security crises, and generational shifts. However, the answer to whether to bear the immense burden of embracing and supporting North Korea as one family seems to already be clear. It would be far more realistic to guide North Korea toward a path of economic growth on its own, with a strategy in which South Korea grows alongside it in the process. These counterarguments do not invalidate the reality that in the current phase, 5 conditions are simultaneously met, and the structural stability of the North Korean regime is high. However, they suggest that this equilibrium is not static, but a dynamic one that can be reshaped at any time depending on specific conditions. The succession issue, a reassessment of China's strategy, and a reversal in South Korean public opinion. In other words, while it is true that the issue of the Korean Peninsula depends on the choices of the parties involved, the South and the North and the people living there, we must not be mistaken in thinking that it depends on the choices of forces holding actual power, not the vague masses. Thus, the reality is that the current situation, and for a considerable period to come, is one that reinforces the structural stability of the North Korean regime and the vested interests. Regrettably, this is the truth, and the collapse of North Korea is a lie. We must re-examine the very question, when will North Korea collapse? While this may not be welcome news to the majority of North Korean residents, we must demand and urge the North Korean leadership to provide practical alternatives that can improve their lives, based on a reality that does not assume the collapse of North Korea. You are the master of your own destiny. That is what Juche ideology teaches. North Korean residents, as we have seen today, no one outside will look after your lives for you. On the contrary, they have a vested interest in helping to stabilize and maintain the current North Korean regime. Consequently, it becomes difficult for you to expect a better life than you have now under the current system. While the vested interests may live in luxury by relying on China and receiving rent under the pretext of guarding the North Korea-China border cheaply, the majority of residents will always live in hardship. You must mobilize the leadership to embrace capitalism on your own and create an environment where you can earn money through sequential opening and reform. The collapse theories repeated over the past 30 years have always focused solely on North Korea's internal vulnerabilities. But in reality, it has been the strategic choices of external actors that have defined the regime's survival. China's continued support, the establishment's desperate maintenance of control, the absence of an incentive for attack from the free world due to nuclear armament, economic operation, feasible through limited openness, and South Korea's weakened will to exert pressure the current structure, in which these 5 conditions are met simultaneously, is aligned more favorably for the regime than at any time in the past. However, given that this alignment is not fixed, but a dynamic equilibrium that can be reorganized depending on the potential changes of each axis, rather than definitively concluding whether it will collapse, we must all strive to ensure that the 5 axes each improve the economic environment of the North Korean people. To achieve this, we should all work towards a direction where North Korea embraces a market economy and paves the way for neighboring powers through restrained openness, thereby moving toward achieving long-term regime stability and economic growth through a balance of power within the country. Thank you.